Would you rather have a comforting lie, or the utter emptiness of having no answers at all? Think about it for a moment. Imagine something simple, everyday, almost banal. You send an important message and receive no reply. No okay, no I'll talk to you later, no sign. Just silence. What happens inside you in the following minutes? The discomfort starts small, almost imperceptible. But little by little your mind kicks in. Maybe the person is busy. Maybe they got upset. Maybe something happened. And before you know it, your brain has already constructed a whole story, even without any real evidence. Have you ever experienced this? This discomfort in the face of not knowing is not weakness, nor a lack of emotional control. It's something much deeper. The human brain simply hates silence. It doesn't cope well with blank spaces, with gaps, with unanswered questions. And when it doesn't find sufficient explanations in the external world, it creates its own. Even if they are inaccurate. Even if they are false. Because, for the brain, a wrong explanation is usually less threatening than no explanation at all. Perhaps you've never stopped to think about it this way, but the brain wasn't shaped to seek truth above all else. It was shaped to ensure survival, predictability, and a sense of control. Informational silence, that total absence of meaning, activates something very similar to an internal warning signal. It's as if deep down something is saying, be careful. You don't know what's happening. And, for a brain that evolved in environments full of invisible risks, not knowing has almost always been synonymous with danger. What you're about to discover might surprise you, because this mechanism doesn't only appear in extreme situations. It manifests itself all the time. When you interpret someone's gaze, when you try to understand strange behavior, when you seek meaning in coincidences, when you create certainties from very little information. The brain prefers to close the story quickly rather than live with the anguish of emptiness. It prefers a narrative, any narrative, to absolute silence. And that's when curious things start to happen. Memories rearrange themselves, assumptions gain the status of fact, strange sensations seem to have clear causes, even when they don't. Many of the certainties we carry didn't originate from reality, but from the urgent need to make sense of something that remained unresolved. The brain fills in gaps like someone patching a hole in the dark, using whatever is at hand. Stay with me until the end of this video because understanding this process completely changes how you see your own thoughts, your decisions, and even your deepest beliefs. Along the way, you'll realize that the discomfort of not knowing is one of the most powerful drivers behind the strange phenomena of the human brain. And perhaps you'll begin to question how many times you've accepted an explanation simply because it seemed better than admitting, I don't know. The human brain hates silence, and I'll explain why. But first, let's leave a question hanging in the air. If your brain is capable of inventing answers just to avoid emptiness, how many stories do you tell yourself every day without realizing it? It's precisely from this point that we begin to understand how the brain creates meaning, even when reality offers none. And perhaps, as you listen to this, a specific situation has already come to mind. A moment when the silence was so unsettling that any explanation seemed better than facing the void. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far. It could be an experience, a thought, or even a question that had never been put into words. When you comment, this conversation stops being just mine and becomes ours, and that changes everything. Like the video too, because this simple gesture helps this content reach more people who, perhaps right now, are experiencing the same discomfort of not knowing and not understanding what's happening inside their own heads. Sometimes, all someone needs is to realize they're not alone in this silent experience. And if you feel that this type of reflection makes sense to you, subscribe to the channel. Not as an automatic click, but as a sign that you want to continue exploring these strange and fascinating mysteries of the human brain. Your participation here is what keeps this space alive, relevant, and moving, allowing us to delve deeper and deeper into these questions that almost no one asks but everyone feels. This channel grows from this connection of curious, restless people, willing to look inward and question what always seemed too obvious. And now that you've understood how the brain reacts to silence, it's worth continuing because what happens after it decides to invent an answer is even more intriguing. When we talk about silence, we almost always think of the absence of sound, of external stillness. But, for the human brain, the most disturbing silence is not what is heard, it's what is not understood. It's the lack of information, the absence of meaning, the blank space where there should be an explanation. And here lies something fundamental that completely changes how we perceive the mind. For the brain, not knowing is never neutral. I don't know is not a comfortable state of waiting. It is interpreted as a warning sign. This doesn't happen by chance. For most of human history, Living meant surviving in unpredictable environments, full of invisible risks. Imagine walking through an open territory and realizing that something has changed. A sound that suddenly ceased. A movement that wasn't completed. A strange absence where there was once a pattern. That wasn't tranquility. That was potential danger. Uncertainty could mean a predator, a trap, an imminent threat. Those who stopped to reflect too much in the face of the unknown simply didn't leave descendants. This evolutionary past continues to live within us. It operates behind the scenes, silently shaping reactions that today seem emotional or irrational, but which have deep roots. When the brain doesn't receive enough information, it doesn't interpret it as a neutral moment. It understands it as a risk. And risk demands action. Even if that action is only mental. Even if it's inventing a response. That's why informational silence generates anxiety. Not that intense and visible anxiety, but a subtle, persistent discomfort that pressures the mind to do something. The explanation may be fragile, improvised, incomplete. Still, it brings relief. Because the brain prefers a poorly told story to absolute emptiness. It prefers an imperfect version of reality to the feeling of being lost. There is a hidden truth here that we rarely confront. The brain was not designed to seek truth above all else. It was shaped to reduce threat and increase predictability. Truth is valuable, but the feeling of control is often more urgent. When meaning is lacking, the brain goes into emergency mode and begins to construct meaning from whatever material is available. It transforms silence into narrative, gaps into explanation, the unknown into certainty. This directly affects how we make decisions. Ambiguous behavior becomes intention. A random event gains cause. A fleeting feeling transforms into conviction. The brain doesn't want to remain in suspense. It wants to close cycles, conclude stories, put an end to them. Even if that end is artificial. Maintaining an open-ended question requires energy. It demands tolerance for ambiguity. It demands emotional maturity and a flexible mindset. The brain, always seeking efficiency, avoids this whenever possible. It saves resources by accepting a quick explanation. This economy, however, comes at a price. Over time, we have come to live surrounded by interpretations that have never truly been verified. They have only filled an uncomfortable silence. This process happens so many times throughout life that it becomes invisible. It blends with who we are. Many personal beliefs, many emotional certainties, many stories we tell ourselves and others were born exactly like this. Not as a result of solid facts, but as improvised responses to uncomfortable voids. It's a silent journey, made behind the scenes of the mind, that shapes our perception of reality without us realizing it. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding silence as a biological threat completely transforms how we view human behavior. It's not just about scientific curiosity. It's about understanding how this mechanism influences our mindset, our choices, and how we interpret the world. When the brain senses that there aren't enough answers, it doesn't wait passively. It acts. It creates. It decides. This creative impulse is not, in itself, negative. It was essential for the survival of the species. The problem arises when we live in a complex world, full of nuances, but continue to use mental tools created for immediate dangers. The clash between these two realities generates distortions. The brain seeks shortcuts, oversimplifies, creates comfortable explanations for situations that would require more patience and reflection. Perhaps you are beginning to realize now how many times you felt discomfort when faced with an unanswered question. How many times you preferred to conclude something quickly rather than live with the doubt. How many times the silence seemed too heavy to bear. This recognition is not a judgment. It is a revelation. Because when we see these patterns, we begin to have the chance to choose something different. And there's a next step in this process. Because after the brain decides that silence is intolerable, an even more intriguing question arises. What kind of explanation does it choose to accept? And it is precisely at this point that the journey becomes even deeper, stranger, and more revealing. Before moving on, leave a simple mark of this reflection here in the comments. Right, that makes sense to me. When we begin to observe more closely, it becomes clear that the human brain does not function like an impartial judge waiting for all the evidence before striking a verdict. It functions much more like a real-time narrator, someone who needs to tell a story while events are still unfolding. The brain is, above all, a machine for creating meaning. Not for seeking absolute truth, but for interpreting the world quickly enough to maintain a minimal sense of order and continuity. This explains why it rarely waits for the complete picture. Waiting requires patience, and patience has never been the strong point of a system designed to survive in unstable environments. The brain prefers to interpret with what it has at hand. Some data here, a feeling there, an old memory serving as a reference. From this, it assembles a narrative that seems coherent. Not necessarily correct, but coherent enough to move forward. There's a simple metaphor that helps to understand this process. The brain prefers to complete the story, even if it's with the wrong pieces. Imagine trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle in the dark. Instead of admitting that it can't see the pieces properly, the brain forces them to fit. It adapts, presses, adjusts. The result even looks like a complete image, but several parts don't belong there. Still, the relief of having an image is greater than the discomfort of leaving the puzzle incomplete. This impulse to close stories profoundly shapes our mindset. It influences how we interpret conversations, attitudes, silences, and even random events. The brain doesn't like open endings. It doesn't handle ellipses well. Where there's a gap, it sees an opportunity, or a need, to create meaning. And this happens so automatically that we rarely realize the exact moment when interpretation replaces fact. Many decisions that we believe to be rational stem from this process. First comes interpretation, then justification. The brain creates an intuitive, almost instantaneous explanation, and only then constructs arguments to support it. This inversion is subtle, but it has a huge impact. We begin to defend internal narratives as if they were solid truths, when in reality, they are merely quick attempts to make sense of the world. Behind the scenes of the mind, this mechanism works tirelessly. It connects dots that don't necessarily connect. It gives meaning to coincidences. It transforms vague sensations into emotional certainties. And the more times a story is repeated internally, the more real it seems. Familiarity becomes proof. Repetition becomes hidden truth. The brain doesn't ask if it's true, it asks if it makes sense within the narrative that's already underway. This is one of the great revelations about how we think. We make sense before we make it true. Interpretation comes first. Checking, when it comes, appears later, and often only to confirm what has already been decided internally. This doesn't mean the brain is inherently flawed. It means it was designed to act, not to wait. To reduce uncertainty, not to celebrate mystery. Throughout life, this meaning-making machine refines itself. It learns patterns, creates shortcuts, adjusts past experiences. But the principle remains the same. Faced with incomplete information, the brain doesn't freeze. It moves forward. It fills in the gaps. It builds. And the more emotionally charged the situation, the faster and less discerning this process becomes. Emotion accelerates interpretation. Urgency diminishes precision. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding the brain as a machine of meaning, and not of truth, completely changes how we perceive our own certainties. It changes how we deal with conflicts, with difficult decisions, with internal doubts. We realize that many convictions that seem solid are, in fact, fragile structures erected to avoid the discomfort of uncertainty. This realization is part of a transformative journey. Not in the sense of eliminating this mechanism, that would be impossible, but of gaining awareness of it. When we understand that the brain prefers to close stories quickly, we begin to question which stories we are accepting without realizing it. Which decisions were made simply to relieve tension? Which truths do we carry that may just be convenient narratives? The impact of this is profound. It affects relationships, career choices, worldview, and even how we interpret ourselves. How many times have you told a story about who you are, about what others think of you, without ever having complete data? How many times has that story become your identity? The brain loves this kind of continuity. It creates a narrative line and clings to it because changing the story requires revisiting the original silence that gave rise to everything. And that's precisely where the process gets even more interesting. Because after the brain creates meaning, it begins to protect it. It filters information, rejects contradictory data, and reinforces what keeps the narrative alive. Not out of malice, but out of internal coherence. A closed story brings stability. An open story demands cognitive courage. This is one of the most delicate points in this mental journey. Realizing that not everything that makes sense is true. That some explanations exist only to avoid emptiness. That some certainties are, in fact, emotional patches. And the deeper we look into this, the more we understand why the brain clings so much to its own stories. Before continuing with this reflection, leave a small note here in the comments, something simple just to mark this moment in the journey. Write this: I'm on this journey too. There's a curious moment in almost every human experience. That instant when something happens but it doesn't happen completely. A piece is missing. A detail is missing. A clear explanation is lacking. And that's exactly where the brain comes into action. Not consciously, not as a rational choice, but as a deep reflex. Faced with a gap, the brain doesn't wait. It fills it in. When information arrives incomplete, the mind begins to work behind the scenes. It searches for past references, associated emotions, similar memories, already known patterns. In a few seconds, a story begins to form. And the most intriguing thing is that this story usually seems so natural, so obvious, that we rarely stop to question where it came from. We simply feel that it makes sense. And that is usually enough. Think of something simple. Someone answers more briefly than usual. They don't explain. They don't provide context. They just change their tone. What happens inside you at that moment? The brain doesn't accept that emptiness as something neutral. It starts creating hypotheses. Maybe the person is irritated. Maybe they're tired. Maybe you did something wrong. In a matter of seconds, an internal narrative is established. And often this narrative begins to guide emotions and decisions as if it were a concrete fact. The same thing happens with ambiguous events. Something goes wrong but there's no clear cause. A plan doesn't work, an opportunity is lost, a conversation doesn't flow. The brain hates this kind of uncertainty. So it invents connections. It creates causes. It constructs quick explanations. Not always correct but emotionally satisfying. That's how emptiness transforms into certainty. This mechanism is so automatic that we rarely notice the exact moment it kicks in. We don't feel like we're making up something. We feel like we're understanding. The interpretation comes with the force of truth. And from there we begin to react not to what happened, but to the story the brain told about what happened. This is one of the great revelations of this mental journey. Many of the certainties you hold were born from a void. Not from complete facts, not from deep analyses, but from gaps quickly filled to alleviate discomfort. The brain cannot tolerate blank space. It sees absence of meaning as something to be corrected immediately. Behind the scenes of the mind, this filling in happens all the time. It connects points that may never have been meant to connect. It transforms coincidences into signals. It attributes intention where perhaps there is only chance. And the more emotionally charged the situation, the stronger this tendency becomes. Emotion doesn't mix with waiting. Emotion demands a quick response. And the brain obeys. This process has a profound impact on how we construct our mindset. It influences how we see others, how we interpret behaviors, and how we make important decisions. Many choices that we believe to be logical actually began as attempts to bridge an emotional gap. First came the story. Then came the decision. Only later, if at all, does reflection appear. Over time, these internal stories accumulate. Some become beliefs. Others turn into convictions that are difficult to question. The brain begins to protect what it has created itself. Not because it is true, but because it gives coherence to the internal narrative. Questioning the story would mean returning to the original void. And that requires mental courage. There is something profoundly human in this process. It is not an isolated flaw, but a direct consequence of how we evolved. The brain was shaped to act quickly in uncertain environments. Waiting too long could be costly. Today the scenario is different, but the internal structure remains the same. We live in a complex world, full of nuances, but we carry a mental system that prefers quick answers to open-ended questions. This difference between the external world and internal workings generates silent conflicts. The brain creates simplified explanations for complex realities. It reduces, adapts, distorts. Not out of malice but out of necessity. It seeks immediate emotional impact, not absolute precision. It seeks relief, not necessarily truth. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding how the brain fills in gaps leads us to an even more delicate point. The moment when these stories begin to define who we believe ourselves to be. When an interpretation is repeated many times, it gains strength. It ceases to be just a hypothesis and becomes part of our identity. I am like this. People are like this. The world works like this. Many of these phrases arose from gaps filled in the past. This perception has enormous transformative potential. Not because it frees us from this mechanism, but because it makes us aware of it. When we realize that not all certainty comes from solid facts, we begin to create space for questioning. And questioning here is not about denying everything, but about opening small cracks for new interpretations. It's about allowing some stories to remain unfinished for longer. The impact of this appears in the decisions we make, in how we react emotionally, and in the way we conduct our own journey. We realize that some choices were made only to alleviate momentary discomfort. That some internal truths are, in reality, convenient narratives. And that living with a little silence can be more liberating than it seems. But this path is not simple. It delves into deep structures of the mind. The brain doesn't like having its stories questioned. It resists. It defends itself. Because each created narrative represents stability. And abandoning it means facing again the void that gave rise to everything. It is precisely at this point that the most interesting revelations begin to emerge. Before moving on with this reflection, leave a short note here in the comments, something simple but honest. Write this: that makes sense to me. There's a delicate point in this whole process that's rarely discussed clearly, the moment when the brain realizes that an explanation doesn't need to be true to fulfill its main function. It just needs to soothe. When we look closely, we understand that many explanations we've accepted throughout our lives weren't chosen for their accuracy, but for their emotional comfort. The brain makes a silent trade-off behind the scenes. It gives up accuracy in favor of relief. In this context, a lie doesn't need to be elaborate or conscious. Often it's subtle, almost elegant. A slightly distorted interpretation, a simplified cause, a convenient narrative. Something that allows one to breathe easier. Something that reduces the anxiety born from not knowing. Because informational silence is not just uncomfortable, it's emotionally threatening. Lies soothe. Silence frightens. When an explanation emerges, even a weak one, the body responds. Tension decreases. The mind slows down. The internal system understands that the danger has been named, framed, controlled. It matters little whether this explanation corresponds to external reality. The immediate emotional impact is what counts. The brain quickly learns this pattern and begins to repeat it whenever possible. This explains why, in moments of intense uncertainty, we tend to accept simplified versions of reality. In ambiguous situations, the mind prefers a wrong answer to no answer at all. The absence of meaning keeps the system in a constant state of alert. An explanation, even a false one, allows us to relax. It creates the feeling that something has been resolved, that there is firm ground beneath our feet, even if that ground is imaginary. This mechanism has a profound impact on our mindset. It shapes how we deal with frustrations, rejections, losses, and difficult decisions. Often, we choose to believe something not because we carefully analyze the facts, but because that explanation hurts less. It protects self-esteem. It preserves identity. It avoids confronting questions we don't know the answers to. Behind the scenes of the mind, this happens almost automatically. Anxiety rises in the face of emptiness, the brain offers a story, and emotional relief acts as reinforcement. The mind learns, this worked. And the more times an explanation reduces discomfort, the more likely it is to be reused in the future. Accuracy becomes secondary. Comfort becomes the primary criterion. This pattern influences important decisions. Career choices, relationships, personal stances. How many times does someone remain in a bad situation because the explanation they created to justify it seems less painful than admitting the whole truth? How many times does an internal narrative prevent a necessary transformation simply because it protects against the anxiety of the unknown? There is a hidden truth here that is worth facing calmly. We don't always seek clarity. Often we seek emotional anesthesia. The false explanation acts as a psychological painkiller. It doesn't cure the cause of the discomfort, but it alleviates the symptom. And that's enough for the brain to move on, even if the problem continues to exist in the background. This dynamic also helps to understand why certain beliefs are so difficult to abandon. When an idea brought us relief at a critical moment, the brain begins to treat it as something valuable. Questioning it is not just an intellectual exercise, it's an emotional threat. It means giving up a mechanism that, at some point, helped us bear the weight of silence. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this emotional relief comes at a cost that we don't always immediately perceive. When the brain gets used to trading precision for comfort, it begins to construct an internal reality that is increasingly distant from what actually happens. Decisions become based on protective narratives, not on complete data. The personal journey is organized around stories that avoid pain, but also avoid growth. The impact of this spreads silently. The person feels in control, but something doesn't quite fit. There's a diffuse feeling of repetition, of stagnation, as if the same situations are returning in different forms. This happens because the false explanation resolves the momentary discomfort, but doesn't transform the root of the problem. It soothes but doesn't clarify. Over time, this pattern can become a trap. The mind begins to reject any information that threatens the hard-won emotional comfort. Contradictory data is ignored. Questions are avoided. The internal narrative closes in on itself. And the more closed it becomes, the harder it is to see alternatives. This is a delicate point in the human journey. Realizing that some of our certainties exist only to protect us from silence requires emotional honesty. It requires a willingness to feel discomfort again. Because abandoning a false explanation means, even if temporarily, returning to the void that gave rise to it. And the brain resists this with all its might. Even so, this questioning movement carries enormous transformative potential. Not in the sense of living in permanent doubt, but of learning to tolerate blank spaces. Of allowing some questions to remain open for longer. Of understanding that not all anxiety needs to be resolved immediately with a ready-made solution. This learning process changes the way we deal with decisions. Instead of choosing the explanation that calms us down the fastest, we begin to observe which explanation actually holds up. Instead of running from the silence, we learn to listen to it. And it is in this space, uncomfortable at first, that deeper insights emerge, more aligned with reality and with who we truly are. But before we delve any further down this path, it's worth noting this moment of awareness. Leave a simple phrase in the comments to mark this reflection. That makes sense to me. When we look more closely at this process, it becomes impossible to ignore the central role of emotions. There is a widespread idea that we think first, then we feel. But the reality is practically the opposite. Emotion comes before reason. It arises as an immediate, automatic reaction shaped by millions of years of evolution. Only after that does the rational brain come into play, often only to justify what has already been felt. This completely changes how we understand the choice of explanations we accept. The brain doesn't calmly and neutrally evaluate all possibilities to then decide which is the most correct. It evaluates which version of the story generates the least emotional discomfort, which reduces anxiety, which preserves the feeling of security, which hurts the least. Reason, in this context, functions more like a lawyer than a judge. It defends the emotional decision already made. This mechanism has nothing to do with a lack of intelligence or mental laziness. On the contrary, it is deeply linked to emotional survival. In ancient environments, reacting quickly was more important than reacting precisely. An intense emotion signaled danger or opportunity, and the brain needed to act before there was time for detailed analysis. This pattern was so effective that it became part of the basic architecture of the human mind. Today, even living in very different contexts, we carry this system with us. When an ambiguous situation arises, emotion appears first. A tightness in the chest, a diffuse discomfort, a feeling of threat or rejection. The brain perceives this state as something that needs to be resolved. And the quickest way to resolve it is by choosing an explanation that lessens this discomfort. Logic comes later, organizing arguments that make this explanation seem reasonable. This is where many seemingly rational decisions reveal their emotional underpinnings. We choose to believe something because it makes us feel more stable. We defend certain narratives because they protect our identity. We reject information not because it's false, but because it provokes emotions that are difficult to sustain. The brain doesn't ask, "Is this true?" It asks, "Is this bearable?" This dynamic explains why two people can react in completely different ways to the same situation. Each carries a distinct emotional history, different triggers and experiences that have shaped their sensitivity to discomfort. The chosen explanation will be the one that best fits this internal scenario. Objective truth loses strength in the face of emotional truth. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding that emotion precedes reason is one of the most transformative revelations about the human mind. This changes how we view debates, conflicts, and even our own convictions. Many discussions are not about facts, but about unrecognized emotions. About stories chosen to maintain inner balance. When the brain finds an explanation that reduces emotional discomfort, it treats it as something valuable. It begins to protect it. Information that threatens this explanation is filtered, reinterpreted, or discarded. Not out of conscious stubbornness, but out of self-protection. The mind tries to preserve a tolerable emotional state, even if it means distorting reality. This process has a huge impact on one's personal journey. It influences career choices, emotional decisions, and life stances. Often, we avoid necessary changes because the explanation that keeps everything as it is seems less threatening than facing the unknown. Emotion prefers the familiar, even when the familiar is unhealthy. There's a hidden truth here that we rarely face. Growing emotionally requires tolerating discomfort. It requires allowing difficult emotions to exist without being immediately numbed by convenient explanations. But the brain doesn't like that approach. It's been trained to put out emotional fires quickly, to close stories, to restore balance even if artificially. When we understand this, something begins to change. We start to observe our own reactions with more curiosity. Instead of simply asking, "Does this make sense?" we begin to ask, "Is this calming me down?" This simple shift in perspective already creates space for more conscious choices. It doesn't eliminate the emotional impulse, but it allows us to recognize it before it takes over everything. This awareness is part of a silent transformation. It doesn't happen all at once, nor dramatically. It's a gradual adjustment of mindset, a training of perception, an invitation to see one's own thoughts as constructs, not as absolute truths. And this has a profound impact on how we deal with uncertainties, decisions, and internal conflicts. When we realize that accepting comfortable explanations isn't foolishness, but rather an emotional survival strategy, the possibility of choosing something different also arises. Not all the time, not in every situation, but when it matters. We can learn to endure a little more silence, a little more doubt, a little more discomfort. And, paradoxically, this brings us closer to explanations more aligned with reality. This path is not easy because it goes against the brain's natural impulse. It demands presence, honesty, and a willingness to feel. But it is precisely in this space that the greatest revelations emerge. When emotion is acknowledged and not merely suppressed, reason gains space to function more clearly. And the more we delve into this, the more evident it becomes that the choice of explanation is not merely an intellectual act, but a direct reflection of our relationship with emotional discomfort. Understanding this opens doors to real change both in how we think and how we live. Before moving on with this reflection, leave a short note here in the comments, something simple but sincere. Write this: "I'm on this journey too." When we put all these pieces together, the discomfort of silence, the need for meaning, emotional relief, and the dominant role of emotions, we begin to see something even more intriguing. Many of the strange phenomena we attribute to the brain don't arise from nothing. They are not random glitches, nor isolated mysteries. They are born precisely from this constant effort of the mind to create meaning where there is insufficient information. Many phenomena that we call strange begin right here. Sensations without a clear cause are a good example. That sudden feeling that something is wrong, even when everything seems normal. A diffuse discomfort, a sense of presence, a strong premonition without an objective basis. The brain hates this kind of explanatory void. So it does what it knows best: it creates an internal narrative. Sometimes this narrative manifests as fear, sometimes as certainty, sometimes as an almost mystical feeling. Not because something supernatural is happening, but because the brain needs to name what it is feeling to reduce internal tension. The same applies to false memories. Not those caricatured, obviously invented ones, but subtle, plausible memories full of detail. The brain doesn't record the past like a camera. It reconstructs it. And all reconstruction happens in the present, based on what makes sense now. When there's a gap in the memory, the brain fills it with information consistent with the current narrative. The result is a memory that seems real but never happened that way. Still, it fulfills its role. It creates continuity, identity, emotional coherence. These false memories are not isolated errors. They are natural byproducts of a mind that needs to close stories. The past, like the present, cannot remain open-ended. The brain prefers an imprecise memory to a confused void. And the more times a memory is accessed, the more it is re-edited, reinforcing details that support the narrative and erasing those that generate conflict. Historical truth gives way to emotional truth. Another fascinating phenomenon emerges in the form of false intuitions that seem like absolute certainties. That, "I know it's this," feeling that appears without a clear explanation. Many of these intuitions stem from the same source: quick connections made to fill in gaps. The brain recognizes patterns based on past experiences, associated emotions, and internal expectations. When something even slightly resembles a known pattern, it triggers a conclusion. The feeling of certainty comes before verification. And once again this brings relief. Doubt disappears. The story closes. These intuitions may even be correct sometimes, but that doesn't change the mechanism behind them. They are not the result of direct access to hidden truth, but of a sense machine working at high speed. When intuition fails, we rarely question the process. We prefer to adjust the narrative afterward, reinterpret the facts, protect the feeling of internal coherence. The brain doesn't like to admit that it filled a gap with something wrong. Behind the scenes of the mind, all these phenomena share the same origin: intolerance to emptiness. Strange sensations, false memories, unfounded certainties are creative responses to an absence of meaning. They don't arise because the brain is broken, but because it's functioning exactly as it was designed to function. Creating stories, closing cycles, reducing anxiety. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because when we begin to see these phenomena as natural consequences of the search for meaning, something changes in the way we interpret them. They cease to seem like isolated events and become part of a larger logic. A logic that involves survival, identity, and emotional balance. This understanding has a powerful impact on our personal journey. Many people are frightened by these phenomena because they believe they indicate a loss of control or mental failure. But, in fact, they reveal how active, creative, and determined the mind is to maintain a sense of continuity. The problem is not the phenomenon itself, but how blindly we believe the stories it produces. When a strange feeling arises, the brain quickly offers an explanation. When a memory seems solid, the brain guarantees its emotional authenticity. When an intuition appears, the brain presents it as certainty. In all cases, the goal is the same: to eliminate the discomfort of not knowing. Objective truth takes a back seat. Emotional comfort takes over. This dynamic shapes our mindset in profound and silent ways. It influences important decisions, life choices, stances, and even how we define ourselves. How many times have you said, "It's always been this way," or "I know how this ends," based on internal narratives that have never truly been questioned? How many of these certainties arose from gaps that were automatically filled? There is a powerful transformation that occurs when we begin to recognize these mechanisms. Not to deny everything we feel or remember, but to create a space for observation. A space where we can ask, is this a fact or a narrative? Is this a direct perception or an attempt to alleviate discomfort? This simple questioning already changes our relationship with our own mind. This journey doesn't eliminate strange phenomena. They continue to arise. Sensations continue to appear. Intuitions continue to be felt. Memories continue to be reconstructed. The difference is that we begin to see them as signs of a process, not as absolute truths. They become clues about internal workings, not proof of something external. And the more we delve into this, the more we realize that the brain is constantly negotiating between reality and comfort. It chooses stories that maintain emotional stability, even if this distorts perception. Understanding this doesn't make us cold or disconnected. On the contrary, it makes us more aware, more flexible, more capable of dealing with silence without panicking. This point is crucial because it opens the door to something even more delicate: the moment when we begin to realize the cost of relying too much on these automatic explanations. The impact they have on our decisions, our relationships, and how we interpret the world around us begins to become more evident. Before we delve any further into this reflection, leave a small note here in the comments, something simple but true. Write this: "That makes sense to me." There comes a point where this mechanism, which begins as protection, becomes a silent risk. Over-relying on the explanations the brain creates to avoid emptiness may seem harmless at first, but gradually it shapes how we see the world, people, and ourselves. The narrative that arises to soothe begins to occupy too much space. And when that happens, something important is lost along the way. The danger lies not in seeking meaning, that's inevitable. The danger lies in accepting any explanation simply because it ends the anguish. When the brain gets used to quickly closing stories, it starts doing so even when the situation demands more care, more silence, more listening. The explanation becomes a shortcut. And every shortcut has a cost. Important decisions begin to be made based on incomplete narratives. Judgments about people crystallize from initial impressions that have never been revised. Deep-seated beliefs form without the reality having been truly investigated. The brain creates a feeling of clarity, but this clarity is fragile. It doesn't come from understanding, it comes from relief. When an explanation acts as an emotional anesthetic, it reduces immediate pain, but it also reduces sensitivity. The person stops noticing nuances, contradictions, subtle signs that could lead to more conscious choices. The mind becomes less curious and more defensive. Instead of exploring possibilities, it begins to protect certainties. This process directly affects mindset. The way we interpret mistakes, failures, and conflicts changes. Instead of seeing complex situations as learning opportunities, the brain prefers simple stories that preserve self-esteem or avoid discomfort. It didn't work because the other person is like that. This always happens to me. It's not worth trying. Many of these phrases carry ready-made explanations that seem to make sense, but in practice, block any real transformation. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because the impact of this pattern goes beyond individual choices. It shapes relationships, environments, and even worldviews. When we rely too much on automatic explanations, we begin to live in a filtered reality. Everything that confirms the internal narrative is easily accepted. Everything that threatens this narrative generates resistance, irritation, or denial. The mind closes itself in a cycle of self-justification. This is one of the most delicate aspects of human behavior. It's not that people consciously choose to lie to themselves. They simply learn, over time, that certain stories are more comfortable to maintain than others. Questioning these stories requires returning to the original silence, to that uncomfortable space where nothing is defined. And the brain avoids this place whenever possible. The problem is that this comfort has an expiration date. Explanations that act as emotional anesthesia may provide short-term relief, but accumulate impact in the long term. Relationships deteriorate because judgments are never revised. Career paths narrow because decisions were based on narratives of fear. Identity itself becomes rigid, built on stories that were never truly questioned. There's a hidden truth here that often goes unnoticed. The faster an explanation emerges to calm things down, the greater the chance it's incomplete. The brain delivers something immediate because it needs to reduce tension, not because it has reached the best possible understanding. Not every explanation is true, some are merely anesthesia. This numbness can become dangerous when we begin to confuse relief with clarity. When we believe that feeling less discomfort means being right. The mind clings to the feeling of security and loses the willingness to investigate. Silence ceases to be seen as a space for discovery and begins to be treated as an enemy to be eliminated at all costs. This pattern even influences how we deal with new information. Data that challenges the internal narrative is perceived as an emotional threat, not as a learning opportunity. The reaction is not curiosity, it's defense. The old explanation is reinforced, adjusted, protected. The brain works to keep the story alive, even if it no longer serves its purpose. Throughout one's personal journey, this can generate a strange feeling of repetition. The same situations seem to repeat themselves with different faces. The same conflicts arise in new contexts. The person feels they are always arriving at the same conclusions, making similar decisions, facing similar impacts. This happens because the internal narrative has never truly been revised. It has only been reapplied. There is a crucial moment in this process when we begin to realize that some explanations protect us, but also limit us. That some certainties are not anchors but crutches. Recognizing this is not comfortable. It requires courage to admit that perhaps we have believed in incomplete stories for too long. But it is precisely there that the possibility of change arises. When we stop accepting any explanation just to avoid emptiness, something opens up. The mind gains space for observation. Silence ceases to be merely a threat and begins to transform into fertile ground. A place where questions can exist without immediate answers. Where decisions can mature before being made. Where judgments can be suspended. This shift doesn't happen radically. It's subtle, gradual, almost imperceptible at first. It begins with small pauses. Small internal questions. Maybe I don't know yet. This is an interpretation, not a fact. These simple gestures already change the internal dynamic. They reduce the power of automatic narratives. And the more we delve into this, the more we realize that true transformation doesn't come from finding better explanations, but from learning to live with the space between one question and another. This space, which once seemed unbearable, begins to reveal something different. It becomes a place of choice, not panic. It is at this point that the relationship with one's own mind begins to change. Explanations continue to emerge because that's part of how the brain works. But they are no longer accepted automatically. They begin to be observed, questioned, felt. And this profoundly alters the impact they have on decisions, judgments, and beliefs. This process paves the way for something even deeper. Understanding what happens when, instead of running from the void, we begin to face it with more presence. What changes when silence ceases to be the enemy and becomes part of the mental journey? It is precisely in this territory that the next revelations begin to take shape. Before moving forward with this reflection, leave a simple sentence in the comments, just to mark this point in the journey. That makes sense to me. After traversing all these paths, the discomfort of silence, the machine of meaning, the gaps filled, the emotional relief, emotions guiding explanations, and the risks of relying too much on one's own narratives, it becomes clearer what the true challenge of the human brain is. It is not in discovering the absolute truth about the world. It is in maintaining a minimum sense of inner security while navigating a complex, ambiguous, and often unpredictable environment. The brain doesn't seek truth. It seeks security. This phrase seems simple, but it carries a profound impact when truly assimilated. Because it changes the starting point of almost everything. We come to understand that many certainties were not born from reality, but from the need for emotional stability. They arose as quick answers to uncomfortable silences, to doubts that seemed too great to be sustained at that moment. Throughout life, we accumulate these certainties as if they were bricks in an inner house. Each one helps to give shape, identity, continuity. The problem isn't building this house. That's inevitable. The problem arises when we forget that many of these bricks were improvised. They were placed there not because they were the best, but because they were the only ones available at the time. And over time we begin to treat this structure as something solid, immutable, almost sacred. There is something profoundly human about this. It's not weakness. It's not ignorance. It's adaptation. The brain has learned that living in a permanent state of uncertainty is unsustainable. So it creates zones of cognitive comfort. Stories that explain the past. Narratives that anticipate the future. Certainties that organize the present. All of this reduces internal noise and allows us to move forward. But that's precisely where the challenge lies. Because emotional security is not the same thing as clarity. An explanation can soothe without clarifying. Certainty can protect without liberating. A narrative can make sense and yet be far from the hidden truth of the facts. And when we confuse these things, we begin to live within versions of reality that have never truly been questioned. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the real turning point isn't in eliminating false explanations, but in developing the ability to observe them. It's about noticing, in the midst of the experience, when an internal story emerges more to soothe than to understand. It's about noticing that almost automatic impulse to close a question just to avoid the discomfort of, I don't know. This invitation to observation changes the relationship with one's own mind. Instead of fighting against thoughts, we begin to listen to them. Instead of rejecting explanations, we begin to investigate them. Where did this come from? What is this story protecting? What emotion is it trying to regulate? Often, simply asking these questions diminishes the power of the automatic narrative. This process isn't about living in constant doubt, nor about deconstructing everything all the time. It's about creating space. Space between stimulus and explanation. Between emotion and decision. Between silence and the story that emerges to fill it. This space is uncomfortable at first, but it carries enormous transformative potential. When we begin to tolerate a little more inner silence, something curious happens. The mind slows down. Explanations become less urgent. Decisions mature. The brain continues to seek security because that's part of its nature, but it begins to find that security not only in ready-made stories, but also in its own capacity to sustain open-ended questions. This is a subtle but powerful movement. It changes how we deal with mistakes, conflicts, and difficult choices. Instead of immediately resorting to numbing narratives, we begin to allow the experience to be felt before it is explained. This doesn't eliminate anxiety, but it transforms it. It ceases to be an enemy and becomes a sign that something important is at stake. Throughout this journey, it becomes easier to realize when we are accepting an explanation simply because it resolves the discomfort. It becomes easier to notice when a certainty is there to fill an old void. And little by little, a more honest relationship with one's own mind emerges. Not a perfect relationship, but a more conscious one. The brain will continue creating stories. It will continue filling in gaps. It will continue searching for meaning. That doesn't change. What can change is how we position ourselves in relation to this process. Instead of being swept along by it, we begin to walk alongside it, observing, adjusting, choosing with more presence. And perhaps that is the true challenge for the human brain in today's world. Learning to live with uncertainty without panicking. Sustaining silence long enough for deeper explanations to have a chance to emerge. Recognizing that not every immediate answer deserves to be accepted as truth. When we look at all of this together, a question inevitably begins to resonate. A simple yet perplexing question that doesn't demand a quick answer and perhaps doesn't even have a definitive one. It remains there, open, like an invitation to continuous reflection. How many of your certainties exist simply to fill a silence? If this question resonated with you, leave a brief but sincere comment below. Write this, I'm on this journey too. If you've made it this far, it's because this conversation somehow found a place for you. And when that happens, it's worth turning that moment into something more. Subscribe to the channel to continue exploring this type of content calmly, in depth, and with curiosity, always looking behind the scenes of the brain and the stories it creates without us realizing it. If this video stayed with you until the end, leave a simple comment just to mark your presence on this journey. You can write something like, I'm with you until the end, or, this message was for me. Sometimes, putting it into words helps to organize what's still echoing inside. If this conversation resonated with you, please like the video. Not as an automatic gesture but as a sign of connection with this type of reflection. This helps the channel continue delivering content that goes beyond the obvious. There's a video over there that complements this topic and delves even deeper into this journey about the mind, decisions, and the stories we tell ourselves. Click there and continue watching.